All the information in this video is pre-release information and is therefore subject to change. I just moved and there's a family of birds living outside my window, so you guys are gonna have to deal with noise-suppressed meese for a little bit. Hello. Sandrone is about to come out, and we're about to get our second round of unit buffs after the Hexarai buffs. And since I was such a big fan of Hexarai, I figured it'd be good to get out a little bit ahead, talk about my opinions and how these buffs work. Because overall, I don't have great opinions about these buffs, but there are a good few interesting things that I'm happy are getting included in characters' kits, and I'm interested to see how my opinion is going to change once the buffs actually come out. Let's start off with talking a little bit about how the buffs work in the first place. We have 7 characters in this lineup, including these 4 here: Wriothesley, Qiqi, Cyno, miko, as well as Diona, Beidou, and Mizuki. Something you may notice about these characters is that aside from Mizuki, they are all of the cryo or electro elements. And that's for good reason. A lot of these buffs are centered around superconduct and the new reaction that Sandrone is about to introduce, stellar conduct. And that kind of brings us to my first big holdup about these new buffs. While some of them are being introduced into the characters' base kits, a lot of them do require you to trigger stellar conduct, which as of the time the buffs are going to be released, the only character in the game that enables stellar conduct is going to be Sandrone. Obviously, that's not going to remain the case. We are likely going to get another supportive unit that enables stellar conduct. The Tsaritsa is likely going to have a passive like Columbina's, where she enables all the special reactions of her region. But for at least one patch, the only character that enables the reactions that enables these new buffs is going to be Sandrone, and if you don't pull her, you're gonna have to wait to get access to them. I myself don't plan on pulling her, so I'm gonna be putting a little bit more weight on the buffs being introduced to the character's base kits. I think that's part of what Hoyo is doing. I think they're trying to make these reactions and these new buffs feel exclusive, so you feel you have to pull Sandrone to get access to these new buffs that might be on your favorite characters. I mean, I know I'm a big Wriothesley fan, but I just want to get this out there right away. Do not pull Sandrone unless you want Sandrone for Sandrone. If your sole reason for pulling the character is to get access to these new buffs, I promise you it's not worth it. Especially because Sandrone is an on-fielder, so if either one of your favorite characters is Wriothesley or Cyno, Sandrone will effectively be a dead slot in the team. It's pretty difficult to run a team with 2 on-fielders. There is likely going to be an off-fielder that enables these reactions that is able to do more for these characters. So just be patient and don't let Hoyo get you with their tactics. First things first, let's talk about how the stellar conduct reaction even works. The first big difference is that, unlike regular superconduct, stellar conduct is not going to deal any direct damage of its own. It still does shred physical res, but that's where its similarities with regular superconduct end. After triggering it, stellar conduct has 2 main effects. First thing it does is it creates a field, which I'm going to visualize by using Chongyun's skill, and standing inside this field will activate Stellar Radiance for all characters in your party. Stellar Radiance doesn't have any effect of its own. It's pretty much just a trigger condition to activate these buffs. Similar to the Hexarai Secret Right tag or the Ascendant Gleam tag, it wants you to meet a certain condition to activate parts of a character's kit. But instead of requiring you to put 2 specific characters in a team like Hexarai and Moongleam do, it just needs you to have one character that can trigger the related reaction, in this case, Stellar Conduct. The second thing Stellar Conduct does is it gives you the potential to give a full party damage bonus buff. I say potential because you do have to meet some conditions to get it. These conditions actually changed in beta, so I'll go over both of the trigger conditions. The first iteration of this effect counted elemental hits. Once you trigger Stellar Conduct, it starts tracking how many cryo and electro hits you did. Every 3 hits would give you 1 stack of an effect that increases your full party damage bonus to cryo damage, electro damage, and stellar conduct damage. The new updated version of it works in mostly the same way, but instead of tracking raw elemental hits, it tracks application. And instead of needing 3 applications to get a stack of this effect, you only need 1 application. This actually changes very little, given that most characters have standard ICD. They only apply their own element every 3rd hit anyways. This change going from tracking hit count to elemental application changes almost nothing. There's also a chance they might change it back to the older version, the one that counts hits, which is why I wanted to go over both versions, but it doesn't really matter. Both of them are just incentives to run characters in your team that have high hit rates. Personally, I'm a big fan of the fact that this full party damage bonus buff goes to both stellar conduct damage and regular electro and cryo damage, because the 3 limited characters getting buffed, Wriothesley, Cyno, and miko, are all getting stellar conduct damage added into their kits, but they still can do some amount of regular elemental damage. And of course, this also benefits non-stellar units. Now that that's done, let's get into the character kit changes. I actually don't want to start with any of these characters. I'd like to start off with some of the less interesting units and move into the more interesting ones later. While Diona didn't get absolutely nothing, I think within the context of the rest of these buffs, she's easily the most left behind, because both her and Qiqi got new jobs as superconduct off-field supports with some defensive utility, but frankly, Qiqi just does a much better job of it. What Diona got was actually pretty small. Just a refresher on her base kit. Her skill throws out these little cat paws, and when they hit enemies, they generate a shield. Each paw that hits extends the duration of the shield. Her tap skill fires 2 of them. Her hold skill fires 5. This is a single hit ability. It doesn't have any sort of off-field presence. The only off-field application she has is through her burst, but her base kit changes gave her a way to launch these paws from off-field. For 20 seconds after she's used her skill, if you trigger a superconduct, stellar conduct, or cryo swirl, she'll fire 3 additional paws. These extra paws don't generate energy or a shield, they're just for application and damage. The paws are also tagged as skill damage, so they do allow Diona to use tenacity, but this coordinated attack has a 3.5 second cooldown and a requirement to trigger a reaction. Tenacity's attack buff has a 3-second duration. Even if you ignore the fact that you need to trigger a reaction to get these paws to fire, you don't get full uptime on tenacity. There will at least be a half-second window between tenacity expiring and the paws firing again. And as I mentioned, they require you to trigger a reaction, and it's likely that you won't be meeting this condition exactly every 3.5 seconds. So your downtime on tenacity is going to be even more. It's possible you can get a full second where tenacity isn't active on Diona. These 3 characters were buffed seemingly with the intent to be stellar conduct supports, and right now the main stellar conduct on-fielder in Sandrone deals her damage in big bursts. It's very likely that one of these bursts will come out at a time when tenacity isn't active, and in that case, it'll effectively be like Diona doesn't even have an artifact set on. However, it is pretty notable that this off-field cryo application is not locked to stellar conduct. You don't need to be in stellar radiance to trigger this effect. Diona is going to be able to access this new off-field application in any team she's played in, as long as a superconduct or a cryo swirl are triggered. And also, looking at the scalings, her icy paws definitely don't have the highest scaling at 80% per paw, but when you fire 3 of them, that's a total of 240% motion value every 3.5 seconds. That isn't really even approaching good damage, but I do think it's interesting that Diona is going to have some small potential to do a little bit of off-field damage. I really don't want to hype this up. This is like Prune levels of off-field damage. Prune really does not deal very much off-field damage at all, but it's non-negligible is my point. If you've met her ER needs and you're fine with a weaker shield, then it is going to be possible to run some damaging stats on Diona. Not good, but possible. And I think that's kind of fun. Now let's move into her constellations, and these stellar buffs follow in the path of the Hexarai buffs by only giving new effects to the C6s of 4 stars. Now already, Diona C6 has a little bit of synergy with Stellar Conduct, given that it gives 200 EM to the active character if they're above 50% HP. Stellar Conduct has the same properties as Lunar Damage, where it doesn't scale off regular damage bonus and it scales off of EM instead. So that 200 EM is going to result in a decent chunk of stellar damage bonus. She's also getting some new effects. Number 1, at a baseline, she just gets an additional 25% max HP. That's just a nice little increase to her healing and the strength of her shield. Neither of these are horribly necessary, but they're both nice defensive utility. And the final effect added to her C6 is the only effect in Diona's kit that's locked behind Stellar Conduct. On top of the 200 EM that you already get from standing in the field, if you trigger Stellar Conduct, you'll also get a 40% damage bonus to Superconduct, cryo swirl damage, and stellar conduct damage, which is obviously the most important. Cryo swirls and superconducts don't deal very much damage, so that's really only meaningful to on-fielders who deal stellar conduct damage. And that's it for Diona. She gets a little bit of extra stellar conduct buffing in her C6 to go along with the 200 EM. She's going to get a little bit of off-field application as well as some non-negligible damage, and she gets a little bit of extra HP to make her defensive utility a little bit better. Before I move on, I just want to doubly make clear that Diona is not going to become a good off-field damage dealer. This is probably mostly just going to be a gimmick thing. I might make a little video about Diona dealing some damage off-field. It's mostly spurred by the fact that she doesn't really have many other stats that she wants to be building. If you're fine with a lower amount of healing and a smaller shield, then you can very easily sacrifice her defensive utility and go all in on damage. And maybe we can actually start making use of the fact that she ascends with cryo damage bonus. Let's move on to Beidou. Just like Diona, Beidou got some cool and interesting stuff in her base kit that gives her a little bit of potential to deal some more damage. And the only thing in her kit that's locked behind Stellar Conduct is a small buff in her C6. So let's go over the base kit stuff because this is actually some of the stuff that I am most excited for. Beidou is pretty difficult to run for a few different reasons right now. She's a character who deals almost all of her damage in her burst, but that burst is very high energy cost, and her energy mechanics make it difficult to get, and she also needs to be in hyper-specific AoE scenarios to actually get good damage out of that burst. That actually hasn't changed. She still needs AoE scenarios to get good damage out of her burst, but with these new changes, she has a much easier time getting her burst in the first place, and she's able to do a little bit more damage through her skill. Beidou was the first unit in the game to have access to a parry mechanic, where holding her E puts her into a stance, and at the end of this stance, she unleashes a little electro strike. The base hit does pretty pathetic damage and doesn't have great particle generation, but if you get hit while in this stance, she increases the base damage of the hit and the particle generation. While this is a cool and fun mechanic, it makes Beidou incredibly reliant on enemies behaving in very specific ways to actually deal damage with her skill and get the particle generation she wants to actually use her burst. Later down the line, we got a few other parry characters in Yunjin and Candace, but Hoyo learned their lesson by the time these two came out. If Beidou doesn't get hit by an enemy, she's just screwed. She has to use the base version of her skill with its poor damage and particle generation. But Yunjin and Candace both naturally power up their skill over time, so if they simply hold their skill, it will become stronger and generate more particles. However, this does take a pretty decent amount of time to do. The way they still kept the parry mechanic is that if Yunjin or Candace get hit while they are in this parry animation, they get instant access to the highest damage version with the most amount of particles generated. Beidou's new changes basically make her skill work like Yunjin's or Candace's. Instead of having to rely on an enemy to hit you to get the highest value version of your skill, Beidou will naturally power up her skill over time as long as she holds it. While that is a nice quality of life, it still makes her energy needs pretty high, but her skill gets another secondary effect. Now, based on the level of the skill unleashed, she'll get flat energy and she'll reduce her skill's cooldown. The weakest version of her skill doesn't give her any energy generation or cooldown reduction. The medium version gives her 7 flat energy and will reduce her skill's cooldown by 4 seconds, and the strongest version, if you hold it all the way, will give her 14 energy and reduce her skill's cooldown by 8 seconds. Given that her skill's base cooldown is only 7.5 seconds, that means you can instantly cast her skill again. That cooldown reduction and energy generation effect of her skill does have a 15-second cooldown of its own, so you don't get to spam infinite skills on Beidou now, but she does get the ability to do 2 fully charged skills, which both generate 4 particles for a total of 8 electro particles. Combined with the 14 flat energy, her energy needs are going to be a lot lower than they used to be. Additionally, this skill has some pretty decent scaling behind it. At higher talent levels, it can get upwards of 1,000 motion value. So now, because Beidou has much lower energy needs and she doesn't have any buffs to build for, you're able to build her to deal a lot more damage with her skill. This is again kind of like Diona. Beidou is not going to be a fantastic damage dealer with these buffs, but it is going to give her a nice avenue to do some reasonable damage while not relying on her burst, which requires very specific scenarios to actually deal damage in. I also like that it fixes the issues with Beidou's skill without completely removing the skill expression, because her skill will automatically power itself up every 0.8 seconds, so if you don't get hit, you'll be spending around 3 or 4 seconds on field with Beidou, which is not a short amount of time. If you want to do both of her skills and an enemy isn't hitting you, she is going to eat up a lot of time in your rotation, so you still have an incentive to have good timing and get hit by enemies, but it isn't so binary anymore. It raises her value floor without taking away her skill expression. Now let's take a quick look at her C6. At a baseline, it shreds Electro Res by 15%, which on its own actually isn't a terrible supportive effect. We have characters that give much bigger numbers now, but it's not too bad. And when under Stellar Radiance, she will also shred Cryo Res by 15% and buff the active character's EM by 200. Some additional nice small buffs to any Stellar Conduct on-fielders. And it's also notable that Beidou, just like Diona, has pretty decent defensive utility. At C1, she creates a shield, and her burst reduces the damage taken of the active character while it is active. Overall, the changes to her skill make her able to deal a little bit more damage while also making her burst much easier to get, and she's going to be a pretty nice, comfy defensive option for Stellar Conduct on-fielders. Now, let's talk about Qiqi. The little zombie girl isn't going to be so useless anymore. First things first, let's talk about her base kit buffs. Qiqi is now a usable unit. Yippee! Yeah, right now her kit is just kind of entirely dysfunctional. Her skill is nice, it follows the character around, it applies cryo, it heals for a little bit, but it has a pretty big issue of having a 15-second duration on a 30-second cooldown. She gets 50% uptime on this ability. If you don't give her a sacrificial sword, Qiqi does nothing every other rotation. Thankfully, one of the first things that they did is they reduced her base cooldown by 15 seconds, making it match her duration. So yippee, Qiqi now has off-field cryo application and healing with 100% uptime. Secondarily, the Herald of Frost now also gets a coordinated attack. This coordinated attack scaling is pretty miserable. It's even lower than her Herald of Frost damage, so it's really not meant to do any damage at all. It's mostly there for application, but given how slow and inconsistent Qiqi's cryo application is, it's a nice extra bonus. Additionally, right now, Qiqi is one of the only characters in the game that does not have a way of generating particles, but luckily that's also getting fixed. I believe the current numbers are that she generates 2 cryo particles every 6 seconds. That's not great generation, but it's way better than what she has now, especially because she has this big stinking 80 cost burst. Giving her any energy generation at all is going to make this burst a lot easier to get, and one of the first Stellar Conduct changes that we're going to talk about in her kit is that her burst is actually worth casting now. Previously, it pretty much just did healing. It marks nearby enemies with a talisman, and active characters that deal damage to that enemy will heal for a pretty decent chunk. The damage isn't nothing, but it's really not great. But now, if she casts this burst while in Stellar Radiance, she gets an additional instance of Stellar Conduct damage. It only has a slightly higher multiplier than her regular cryo damage, but given the fact that reaction damage ignores defense, it effectively is going to be significantly higher, and Qiqi is going to be able to deal some pretty decent burst damage. And her second Stellar Conduct buff in her main kit comes from her skill. When it is active, she gives a full party damage bonus buff to Superconduct, Stellar Conduct, and Cryo Swirl damage of 50%. Nothing crazy, but it's a nice chunk of stats. So without Stellar Conduct, Qiqi's kit basically just works now. She doesn't have a stupidly long cooldown on her skill, she generates a little bit of energy now, and she has some actual cryo application. And in Stellar Conduct, she's going to get a pretty chunky full party buff. Oh wait, oops, I almost forgot about one effect. She has this A4 passive. When Qiqi hits opponents with her normal and charge attacks, she has a 50% chance to apply a fortune preserving talisman on them. It has a 30-second cooldown, but if you are in Stellar Radiance, so if you trigger Stellar Conduct, this base chance is going to be increased to 100, and the cooldown is going to be reduced to 15 seconds. This is a pretty negligible effect, given that all that a fortune preserving talisman does is heal your active character. It does give her a little bit of extra healing, it does make her a little bit more consistent, but given that her other buffs were all also geared towards making her do that, and they don't require Stellar Conduct, I think that this is pretty pointless. Oh, and how could I forget? At C4, her Fortune Preserving Talisman debuffs enemy attack. So I guess now, if she's in Stellar Conduct, you can debuff opponent's attack more consistently. Which I'm laughing, but that's actually not a terrible defensive effect. Anyways, let's look at her constellations. C1 right now just gives her a little bit of flat energy, and when she is in Stellar Radiance, she is going to get an additional 6 elemental energy whenever the Herald of Frost attacks or coordinated attacks hit once every 6 seconds. Of course, her base C1 has the caveat that the Herald of Frost has to hit an opponent marked by the Fortune Preserving Talisman, whereas the buffed version of this constellation when she's in Stellar Radiance does not have that restriction. As long as the Herald of Frost or the coordinated attacks hit at all, she'll get that 6 flat energy. C2, very simple. When she's in Stellar Radiance, she gets an additional 50% attack. That's some more damage off of her burst. That's a little bit more healing. Not really a very big deal at all. It matters more once we get to C6. C4 provides the only constellation buff that is not locked behind Stellar Conduct, and basically, it gives her Yehoda healing. When an on-fielder triggers the effect of a Fortune-Preserving Talisman, she will also heal the nearby party member with the lowest amount of HP for 180% of her attack. It makes her a little bit more comfortable to play, but given that healing only mostly matters for Farina and her fanfare generation, and you are not often going to be running Qiqi with Farina, it's not a big deal, but I guess this effect does apply outside of Stellar Conduct, so it does make Qiqi a generically better healer for Farina. D6 gives Qiqi quill buffs specific to Stellar Conduct damage. These quills are worth 600% of Qiqi's attack, but she does only get 4 of them. That's a pretty nice buff. It helps you front load a little bit of your Stellar Conduct damage. You also have to keep in mind that Stellar Quills are just like Lunar Quills, where your Stellar Reaction damage bonus won't apply to any Stellar Quills that you activate. It just gives Qiqi a nice extra buff. It gives her a little something to build for. It helps you get some extra front loaded damage out. It's not the biggest constellation in the world, but it is a nice damage increase. This constellation also technically doesn't have the restriction that you need to trigger Stellar Conduct to activate its effects, but obviously you need to deal Stellar Conduct damage to use the quills that she gives, and you can't deal Stellar Conduct damage without using a character that can trigger the reaction. Whatever, I think I'm talking about this a little bit too much. Qiqi just becomes a nice Stellar Conduct buffer. And C6 gives her another pretty sizable buff. Given that Qiqi is the 5-star, she's obviously a little bit better than either beidou or diona at maximum investment, but you might not have C6 Qiqi. Now that Qiqi's done, let's move on to our other standard character in Mizuki, who is pretty obviously not done being buffed. Because as of right now, none of the buffs that Mizuki got require you to trigger Stellar Conduct to activate. They are all in her base kit and base constellations. Her Dream Drifter state got some small improvements. Now, when she triggers a swirl, her next Animote hit will be buffed to deal an additional 1000% of her Elemental Mastery. This effect does have a cooldown of 2.5 seconds, so you're likely only going to be getting this effect every 3rd attack, but that is not a small amount of additional motion value. So, number 1 change, she deals a little bit of extra Animo damage, and number 2 change, she now gives a full party EM buff based on 10% of her EM. Given that she builds so much EM, both of these buffs are going to be somewhat meaningful. She's going to get a decent chunk of extra damage, and she is going to get a decent chunk of additional buffing. Although, as of right now, it's not a crazy amount of Animo damage. Since right now, her current build path doesn't build damage bonus, doesn't build crit, she is going to have to sacrifice a bit of that EM to build damaging stats to make her skill deal reasonable damage. So it's likely that in the future, Mizuki is going to get some additional Stellar Swirl damage, and given that reaction damage doesn't scale on damage bonus, she'll be a lot more incentivized to do EM crit builds, thus making her kit make a bit more sense. The 10% full party EM buff, I have nothing really to complain about. That's just a nice extra thing that gels well with her current build path. Now let's look at her constellations, because they also got some interesting changes. C1 is basically a duplicate of her damage buff that she got in her main kit. The base effect is that she can occasionally trigger a super powered swirl that does about triple the damage as a regular swirl, and the additional effect is that she will get an additional hit of Animo damage when she triggers this super powered swirl, again equal to 1000% of her EM, around doubling the amount of animo damage that she's dealing. C1 is going to be a pretty significant increase to the amount of animo damage that she's dealing, and it's going to be a lot more worth it to go down that build path. C2, very simple. Base effect, she gives full party damage bonus, and the additional effect is that she is also going to give res shred when she is in the Dream Drifter state. For all of these elements plus animo, again increasing her own personal animo damage and making it more worth it to go down that route. C4 is getting the same change that Qiqi got. The healing from her burst, which is usually single target, will also apply to the lowest HP ally on your team. And C6, her current C6 lets her swirls crit at a fixed rate of 30% crit rate and 100 crit damage, but her buffed C6 will additionally give her regular crit rate and crit damage based on every point of EM she has after 500, up to a maximum of 20 crit rate and 80 crit damage. Again, playing into her personal damage playstyle and making it a lot more worth it to build her in that way. So right now, the buffs to her base kit are neat, but they don't really do enough to make you want to change her build path and start dealing damage with her. She really needs a few constellations to actually start shining in that role. Now, let's talk about our final three, the limited units. Miko, Cyno, and Wriothesley are all getting significant additions of stellar conduct damage to their base kits. Although, like I mentioned before, they don't enable the reaction themselves, so you still need another unit in the team that enables the reaction to access this damage. But they also did get some small buffs to their base kits. Miko got some pretty significant changes because not only did she get text added to her kit, she got some text removed. Going over the basic effects, her skill duration got increased from 14 seconds to 24 seconds, giving her much better uptime and much better flexibility in rotations. She also gets a very small buff to their damage outside of Stellar Conduct. If a party member triggers Super Conduct, then the next instance of damage dealt by one of her turrets will be increased by a fresh 80% of her attack on a 2.5 second cooldown. Given that she roughly shoots one of these attacks every second, one volley of them is equivalent to roughly 500 total motion value if you don't have her C2 and you're rocking level 3 skills. And given that this effect has a 2.5 second cooldown, we'll just say that you can get it once every volley, giving you an extra 80% on top of 500%. Really not a big deal. Now, let's talk about the text that was removed from her kit. Right now, her burst says, when she uses this skill, Miko will unseal nearby Seisho Sakura, destroying their outer forms and transforming them into Tenko Thunderbolts. So, upon using her burst, she will destroy each turret and increase the amount of hits that her burst does based on the amount of turrets destroyed. She still increases the damage of her burst based on how many turrets are existing, but she doesn't consume the turrets anymore, which means you don't have to do 3 skills after using her burst. This greatly increases her quality of life and the speed at which she can rotate, although funnily enough, she got very few buffs to her burst, so even though it has this big quality of life increase where it no longer destroys her turrets, now it just doesn't deal very much damage and is hard to justify using because of that. They also have changed her A1 passive, as it no longer requires you to destroy her Seisho Sakuras to get the cooldown reset, because obviously you can't destroy them anymore. But what's the point of resetting her skill cooldowns if her burst doesn't destroy her turrets anymore and she doesn't have a need to replace them? That's because she's gotten a very small little ability tacked onto this passive, where if you cast her skill while 3 turrets already exist, it won't just replace the turret, it'll also deal a small amount of damage, 40% of her attack. When I say small, I mean small. 40% is pretty low. But if an enemy moves and goes out of range of Miko's turrets, her burst deals some damage while letting you reset the cooldown, and this new effect will let you get a little bit of more extra damage while replacing them. Now, let's talk about the stellar stuff. Both of the additional damage passives that Miko got will be upgraded to Stellar Conduct damage while she is in Stellar Radiance. This instance you get of 40% attack when you replace a turret when all 3 are already out becomes 50% attack of Stellar Conduct damage, and the instance of additional damage that her skill deals when you trigger Stellar Conduct goes from 80% of regular electro damage to 200% of Stellar Conduct damage. That is a very significant increase. Miko is going to be able to deal a lot of Stellar Conduct damage off field. This 50% scaling still isn't great, but it is a nice extra instance of damage that you can get out, and it's certainly better than 40% of regular electro damage. It really is that additional 200% strike that matters the most. And while they didn't give her a lot outside of Stellar Conduct, I do appreciate that they improved the functionality of her kit, and they gave her powered down versions of her Stellar Conduct kit just using regular electro damage. So even though I am not planning on getting Sandrone next patch, there are a lot of things in Miko's kit that are changing, and I'm going to have a lot of fun playing around with all this new stuff. Let's look at the constellations. C1 gives you a full party buff of 50% electro damage and 50% stellar conduct damage whenever Miko triggers a superconduct, a stellar conduct, or deals stellar conduct damage. This is technically usable outside of Stellar Conduct because there is the condition of her triggering a superconduct and it does buff electro damage, but given that Miko doesn't run in many superconduct teams, I imagine it's going to be pretty hard to get use of outside of Stellar Conduct, but I figured I'd mention it. Inside Stellar Conduct, it's real good. It's a very good constellation. Don't know what else to say about it. Given that you can pick it up for free from the constellation selector, it's kind of a no-brainer for Stellar Conduct teams. C2 is a permanent 200 EM buff to Miko and your on-fielder. It's not exactly that, it's a scaling EM buff based on the level of her skill. 60 at level 1, 90 at level 2, 120 at level 3, and 200 at level 4. But given that C2 is what unlocks level 4 of her skill, I assume if you're playing C2 Miko, you're always going to be getting her to her maximum level skill, and then it basically just means 200 EM to herself and your on-fielder. This one is not locked to Stellar Conduct at all. EM is a broadly usable stat. It's just a very cool and flexible numerical increase that she gets. That is also usable in Stellar Conduct. C4 gives her some additional energy generation, 8 energy every 5 seconds, and it also gives her burst a damage bonus buff of 100%. It makes it a little bit more worth using, but still, a lot of her vertical investment focuses a lot more on her skill damage than her burst damage. This definitely helps her burst become a little bit more competitive, but it's not a massive deal. And C6 just gives her a crit damage buff to her Stellar Conduct damage of 200%. Pretty uninteresting. All in all, she's going to have some pretty nice quality of life changes. I'm going to enjoy playing around with a lot of these new tools. She definitely needs Stellar Conduct to elevate her to a higher level, but she's going to be a decent bit better once the patch rolls through. Cyno. Cyno's changes are a lot more simple than Miko's. He has these Duststalker bolts that he launches whenever he uses his enhanced skill. At set periods, you'll get this little eye graphic, and if you use his skill when it's active, he'll fire off these 3 extra bolts when he uses his skill. Being in Stellar Radiance just converts these bolts to Stellar Conduct damage. Pretty simple. The much more interesting part of his kit is something that is in base kit that you do not need Stellar Conduct to activate. He gets a new passive that if he uses his skill when he is not in his burst, he enters his burst state for 6 seconds. 6 seconds doesn't sound like a crazy amount of time. Cyno usually on fields for a lot longer than that. The base duration is only 10 seconds, only 4 seconds longer than this new duration that he's getting. That's of course because Cyno has a mechanic where using his skill while he's in his burst extends the duration of the burst. Information is a little bit shaky right now because leakers don't care about Cyno, but as I understand it right now, these new changes will make his burst almost useless, giving him the ability to enter his burst through his skill, and that special version of his burst that he enters through his skill, as far as I know, still has all the same properties of his burst. That entirely removes the need to build his burst at all, because all of his burst does is put him into his burst state. Cyno already doesn't build very much energy recharge. He often relies on a combination of electro off-fielders with good particle generation and electro resonance to give him all the energy that he needs in a rotation. But in Stygian, when you start with 0 energy, Cyno is a lot more difficult to make work. He takes much longer to build up his initial burst, but with this new buff, Cyno is going to be much more usable in Stygian. He doesn't need any energy recharge at all, and he can simply start on-fielding after using a skill. Again, this is not Stellar Conduct locked. Granted, Cyno is in not a great place right now. and using Cyno and Stygian is still going to be rough even if you don't have to build any energy recharge on him. But this is a fantastic quality of life change for Cyno, and that is it for his base kit changes. So let's look at his constellations. C1 gives him a buff of 200 EM while he is in his burst state, but it's more interesting than just that, because as far as I believe it, the text is a little bit confusing right now, but I'm pretty sure the duration of this EM buff is based on the duration of his burst. So if he enters his burst by using energy, it'll be 10 seconds that can be extended by using his skill more, or if he enters it through his skill, it'll be 6 seconds that can be extended by his skill. The reason why that interesting duration stuff matters is that if you swap off field, the buff doesn't go away, it passes on to your next on-fielder. It's probably never going to be optimal to on-field Cyno for a little bit and then pass an EM buff to another on-fielder, but it's interesting, and when you combine it with how easily he can enter his burst state now, Cyno has the potential to become a much more interesting quick swap on-fielder. C2 gives a bonus effect to C1 and increases the stellar conduct damage of whichever on-fielder the buff is active on. The fact that it gives stellar conduct damage is obviously a lot more restrictive than giving EM, which is a far more widely usable stat, but it does give him more potential to be a much more interesting on-fielder, especially in combination with Sandrone. I feel like I should mention this. Both Sandrone and Cyno are going to be able to swap off field. Neither has much reason to swap off field, but they both can split their rotations in interesting ways, and getting constellations on Cyno will be a fun way to play into that playstyle. C4 is hilarious. The base effect is that when Cyno is in the Paxthorn Path Clearer state, so his burst state, after he triggers any electro reaction, he will restore 3 elemental energy for all nearby party members. Oh, that sounds good, right? He's pretty burst reliant and he has pretty high energy needs, so that's pretty cool. Except himself. The buff version of this constellation basically just fixed that. It also gives Cyno 20 flat energy whenever he triggers one of these reactions on an 18-second cooldown.
Yeah, never mind. It has to be another character triggering a reaction, but usually you will swap out of him a little bit early, and you'll naturally get this in your rotations.
And then the base effect of his C6, he basically gets extra Duststalker bolts, and the buff version does the exact same thing that his base kit does. It converts those Duststalker bolts into stellar conduct damage. Now, let's move on to the final unit, Wriothesley. The majority of his buffs are fairly uninteresting. It just converts regular cryo damage into stellar conduct damage. The 3rd and 5th hit of his normals are both stellar conduct damage now, and the empowered version of his charge attack becomes stellar conduct damage. But C0 Wriothesley notoriously has a lot of issues getting his empowered charge attack, and these buffs only fixed them halfway. So previously, just to kind of go over this quickly, the issue with Wriothesley is that both his normal attacks and his charge attacks do pretty significant damage. And to get the empowered charge attack, you have to drop below 60% of his HP. But to keep his normal attacks buffed by his skill, you have to remain above 50% HP. He's supposed to have a dynamic where his normal attacks consume HP and his charge attacks regenerate HP, but because his base form has a 5-second cooldown on that special charge attack, he ends up consuming HP faster than he can restore it, so he basically has to choose between 2 bad options. Either don't run a healer and let his HP be consumed far too fast and make it so that the buff to his normal attacks is basically never active, or do run a healer and never drop below 60% HP and never get access to his enhanced charge attack. Thankfully, they did pick a direction and they made one of his playstyles make sense. When he's in Stellar Radiance, they reduced the cooldown of his special charge attack from 5 seconds to 2 seconds. So if you're not running a healer, you have a chance of staying above 50% HP and keeping the buff to his normal attacks. But in his C0 kit, the only way to get his charge attacks is still to drop below 60% HP, and 2 of the Stellar Conduct buffers they introduced, both Diona and Qiqi, are healers, and they don't let Wriothesley get access to his special charge attack, which now that it has been converted to stellar conduct damage, it's actually pretty meaningful to get. It provides a very significant damage increase. So Wriothesley is kind of fixed. He at least works if you don't run a healer, but you also can't run a healer. In any case, Wriothesley is slightly more playable and does a little bit more damage, but they still hate him for no reason. Let's talk about constellations.
So I actually misread this constellation. The basic effect is that it pretty much fixes Wriothesley's charge attack issue in both of his playstyles by reducing its cooldown, so if you play him without a healer, he can heal himself up just fine, and also letting him get his special charge attack by landing his 5th normal, so if you play him with a healer, he still has a way of getting it. But his Stellar Conduct charge attack has a different name, and it doesn't say that he gets that new special charge attack when he lands his 5th normal. So as far as it reads, it still doesn't fix Wriothesley's issues with getting a charge attack. He can still only get it by dropping below 60% HP, and that means even a C6 Wriothesley cannot be played with a healer in Stellar Conduct teams. Needless to say, I hate everything about this. It doesn't break the base version of the constellation. If you want to play regular Cryo Wriothesley, that still works just fine. But in Stellar Conduct, all this constellation does is give him bonus damage on his 5th normal attack and his charge attack whenever the other one hits. Landing a 5th normal boosts the charge attack, landing a charge attack boosts the 5th normal.
C2 additionally increases his scaling on all of his normal and charged attacks. This one is the first thing in his kit that we run into that is not Stellar Conduct locked. It also works in his regular playstyle. C4 is mostly unchanged, except he takes 25% less damage now. I don't know what they're doing. And C6 is again mostly the same. Obviously in Stellar Conduct, it converts that additional charge attack he gets to another instance of Stellar Conduct damage, and it also gives him some additional damage on his 5th normal attack if he's in Stellar Conduct. Overall, I don't know why they hate him so much. My initial impressions of these buffs were very negative because I love Wriothesley. I want Wriothesley to be doing better, and they gave him nothing. The only thing that is affected when you are not in Stellar Radiance with Wriothesley is his C2. Everything else is the same, and the only things that really got changed when he's in Stellar Radiance is now he deals Stellar Conduct damage. I am very disappointed with those changes, but to be fair, a lot of the other changes make up for it. Yeah, Miko gets good quality of life. She's going to be fun. Cyno gets good quality of life. He's going to be fun. Diona and Beidou are mostly intended to be Stellar Conduct supports, but the ways that they were buffed, they still have interesting stuff going on. They have ways of dealing more damage. They have different ways of playing their kit. Mizuki is getting a brand new playstyle with a brand new build, and qiqi is a functional unit now. Overall, I'd say I am a fan of these buffs. A lot of them didn't overstep their boundaries, and a lot of this stuff is included in their base kits. All of the most impactful stuff is locked to Stellar Conduct, but there's enough weird stuff in there that I'm gonna have fun playing around with. I'm just being mad about Wriothesley. Wriothesley just got shafted and I'm upset about it. Let me shout out my channel members: Najuro Rompaltas, Mudkip1727, Beef Potato, Roberto Desu, Big Soupin, Buffalo Milk, DB, Bab, TSI Amat, Smoody, Tylee, Juicy Jeepers, Shinzo NN1IT, Corgi Raclette, Bone Shum, Anime King, Anton Uwa, Nichita Smile, AJ Jordan Draws, Aqua, Star Nova, and Padevan. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Thank you for watching the video. Hope you learned something. Have a lovely day.